Majority sale auction process, part 2. This is lesson 2 of class 1. In this lesson, we'll review the steps and procedures required to close M&A deals. Background. In part 1 of this lesson, we covered the components and procedures around bid instruction letters and indications of interest. In part 2, we will cover the components and procedures around letters of intent and definitive agreements. Letters of intent. A letter of intent, or an LOI, is a formal letter expressing desire to purchase the target business. The LOI is sometimes referred to as the offer. The basics of an LOI. In a typical deal funnel, the letter of intent comes after the indication of interest, but an IOI is not a prerequisite for an LOI. For example, in some cases, the buyer might go straight to the LOI. The letter of intent is a more comprehensive version of the IOI and contains some legally binding materials. The main features of an LOI. Components that are typically non-legally binding include purchase considerations, valuation range, check size, special requests, further diligence. The components that are typically legally binding include exclusivity provisions, disclosure and confidentiality assertions, and governing laws. Non-legally binding components. The non-legally binding components of an LOI are generally the same items outlined in an IOI. Now, LOI will restate these items in more granularity and may also include some additional terms not present in the IOI. For example, the LOI might include more specific details around stipulations such as earnouts or rollover equity. It might express valuation as an exact number rather than a valuation range. It might express a more formalized employee retention plan. It might include deal structure, which determines whether or not the deal will be an asset purchase or a stock purchase. The LOI might express specifics on diligence requirements and deadlines, such as the expected deadline for the submission of the purchase agreement, the execution of the purchase agreement, and the expected closing date. The IOI might have additional terms such as contingency sections, which list out certain prerequisites needed for the acquisition to occur, including board approvals and the completion of the buyer's due diligence. Legally binding components. The LOI will include some legally binding terms such as exclusivity, a legally binding agreement that the seller will not actively solicit other offers or go shop while the potential buyer is conducting confirmatory due diligence. Exclusivity typically ranges from 30 to 60 days. Confidentiality, this section reasserts the enforceability of the current NDA in place. This section typically states that the processes and its developments are expected to be confidential. When moving forward with round 2 due diligence, the sellers might want to enhance the terms of the NDA when negotiating with strategic buyers who compete in their same sector. The seller might want to add additional clauses added to protect against potential buyers soliciting current customers, suppliers, and employees of the target. Governing laws. The section determines the state laws that will govern the letter of intent. Additional notes on the LOI. Comparing the letter of intent to a term sheet, practitioners will use the phrase such as collecting term sheets as a reference to deal execution. In layman's terms, collecting a term sheet means taking a deal to market and successfully collecting offers from buyers. Practitioners utilize LOI and term sheet interchangeably to denote an offer, but there are some notable differences. The main difference between these two documents is structure. The LOI is typically in a letter format, whereas the term sheet is provided in shorthand format, typically in a bulleted or boxed format. Definitive agreements. Following the submission and a negotiation of the LOI, the buyer and seller will agree on final deal terms that will be outlined in the definitive agreement. Definitive agreements will be titled based on the deal structure. Popular naming conventions include the APA, which is an asset purchase agreement, or an SPA, a stock purchase agreement, and or a definitive merger agreement. Basics of a definitive agreement. The agreement is a legally binding document that outlines the terms of the business transactions. The definitive agreement is written in the form of a letter that clearly outlines all aspects of the transaction, inclusive of supplementary financial schedules, treatment of current ownership positions, also outstanding options and warrants, and the future employment agreements. The terms drafted in the definitive agreement should reflect the LOI, adjusted for any additional considerations that were negotiated during confirmatory due diligence. The basics of a definitive agreement. The buyer typically gives a deadline that outlines timing around the drafting of the definitive agreement. The buyer will submit the drafted definitive agreement to the seller. Then the seller, in conjunction with its financial and legal advisors, will redline final negotiations. The definitive agreement is a large, complex legal document. Bankers are not legal advisors. They are capital markets advisors. Therefore, at this point in the deal, the bankers will be taking note of all the red lines and negotiations, but ultimately allowing the client's legal team to opine. Nearing the end of the deal, the bankers will mainly focus on advising on earnout structures, non-compete agreements, rollover clauses, calculating vesting schedules and current equity owners for current equity owners and holders of stock options and warrants, calculating working capital pegs, ensuring that all conditions to close have been met in a timely fashion to ensure that closing will occur on its scheduled date. For example, ensuring that the target has sufficiently completed all necessary requirements HSR filings. The date on which the definitive agreement is executed is the date the deal officially closes. Closing and wiring of funds. One of the last steps before the deal is closed is the facilitation of funds. The bankers will assist with the transfer of funds through a document known as a funds flow memorandum. The funds flow memorandum is the sources and uses document that will outline the amounts necessary to close the deal along with wiring instructions for the buyer. It will also likely include the funds necessary to satisfy the buyers and sellers' advisors. Main seller obligation, the seller needs to ensure that all tax and debt liabilities are satisfied. Main buyer obligations, the total amount of funds necessary to acquire the target company. Thank you for tuning into this lesson. We look forward to seeing you in our next lesson, which we will cover minority sale book building.